Welcome to today's webinar titled Interactive Effects in the Theory of Planned Behavior, Examining Attitudes, Norms, Control, and Stereotype Threat to Predict Girls' Math Performance and Intentions. My name is Greg Nagy, and I am the Virtual Learning Community Manager from The Ohio State University, who provides technical support for the STEM Equity Pipeline Project. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items for this webinar. This webinar is scheduled to last roughly 1 hour and is being recorded in order to view this presentation in its entirety later. The recorded webinar will be available in the next few days on the www.stemequitypipeline.org website. As you've already found out, you'll be watching the presenter present slides through the WebEx interface while listening to them talk over your phone. If you cannot get the WebEx software to work today, you can download today's slides from the home page of the STEMequitypipeline.org website and follow along using your phone. All the attendees' phones have been automatically muted. The presenter will answer questions after the presentation. However, we can take questions at any time. This is how we take questions. At any time during the presentation and during the Q&A, you may submit a question by typing it in the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your WebEx screen. The presenter or I will read and respond to these questions at the end of the presentation. I'd like to start the webinar by introducing Freda Walker, Assistant Project Director, National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity Education Foundation. Freda?
Good afternoon and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. And I'm here doing the introduction because Mimi Luskin, the project director, today is in Washington, D.C., and in a few minutes she'll be giving a short presentation to the Obama transition team. So we're getting a little word in about what's happening in Washington. I'll begin with the purpose of today's webinar, and do we have the slides up, Greg?
Yes, they should be up for you now.
Okay. I've got them. Thank you. So I hope everyone else has them. We have two purposes today. One is a short overview of the STEM Equity Pipeline Project, and the other is to learn about stereotype threat. The goals of our project are the following that you can see on your screen. One is to build the capacity of the formal education community. And our project does this by integrating gender equity in STEM into the ongoing professional development events in states that are participating in the project. Our second goal is to institutionalize the implementation strategies by connecting the outcomes to existing accountability systems. And in this case, we connect to the accountability systems that are under No Child Left Behind and Perkins Career and Technical Education core indicators. The third goal is to broaden the commitment to gender equity in STEM education. And one of the ways we do this is through our National Advisory Board. If you look at this model, you can see that our National Advisory Board is at the top, and it helps with advice and resource dissemination. And I would like to say that we really appreciate Carol McGillen, who's from Cisco, and Cisco is sponsoring our webinar today, and we'd also like to thank Krista Hughes for the technical support that she's providing. Our National Advisory Board then works with our Extension Services group that provides professional development, such as what we're doing today, and technical assistance to participating states and consulting and best practices, and then that works with the state teams and then with local educators. Today's webinar has a long title, Interactive Effects in the Theory of Planned Behavior, Examining Attitudes, Norms, Control, and Stereotype Threat to Predict Girls' Math Performance and Intentions. I welcome Bettina Cassad, who is from Cal Poly Pomona, which is in California, and she is going to now begin, and she will give you a shorter title of what we'll be learning about today.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. The title you see in front of you is the title of my grant that's supported by the National Science Foundation's Program for Research on Gender in Science and Engineering. However, I'm going to focus the talk today to what's, I think, most relevant to you all, and that is the role of stereotype threat in women's STEM representation. So the objectives for the webinar today is that I hope that after participating, you will be able to describe the phenomenon of stereotype threat. Currently, It's somewhat of an isolated phenomenon studied by social psychologists in the laboratory, and we're hoping to disseminate this so that more and more people can be aware of it, particularly educators. After this webinar, you should be able to describe how stereotype threat might impact your students, and then be able to describe ways that you can change your classroom learning environments to be what we call identity safe, or environments in which stereotype threat is not a problem. So let's start off discussing what stereotype threat is. Stereotype threat was first published by researchers Steele and his colleague Aronson in 1995. Stereotype threat refers to being at risk of confirming as self-characteristic a negative stereotype about one's group. So the fear that someone will judge you according to a stereotype that exists about your group. So the awareness that one's behavior might be viewed through the lens of stereotypes creates a threat in the air. So we can think of many stereotypes that could cause threat. One that's most relevant to this discussion is the stereotype that women don't perform as well as men in math and science and STEM fields. And so when women are in these disciplines taking evaluative measures, they might worry that their performance will be judged based on their gender. So stigmatized groups fear being reduced to the stereotype and being judged solely on their membership in their group, such as their gender group or their racial group. And this threat in the air can actually lead to underperformance on the task. So I'm going to review with you two of the pivotal studies that demonstrated the effects of stereotype threat. The first one was done looking at race stereotypes with African American and European American students at Stanford University. And the researchers made the racial stereotype of intelligence salient, the stereotype that African Americans have lower intelligence than European Americans. And in this academic environment, the participants were to take a test, and the test was described to one group of participants, the experimental participants, as being diagnostic of ability. So this test will show the researchers their true ability. The other group was told that the test was not diagnostic, so they were told that the test does not inform the researcher of their true ability, and this was the control group, or the group that was not under threat. And then after this instruction, the participants then took a challenging verbal test. So this is what we've found. So on the y-axis, you see the mean number of items solved on the test adjusted by SAT scores, so adjusting for initial verbal ability. On the far right, you see the control condition. And I'm going to get my pointer out here. So here is the control condition, the participants who were told that the test does not reveal their true verbal ability. You can see that the black bar represents the African American participants, the white bar represents the European American participants, and you can see that their performance was equal. So in this non-threat condition, there was no racial gap in performance. However, when you look at the diagnostic condition, which was the experimental group, where participants were told this test will tell us your true verbal ability, you can see that the African American participants performed worse than the white or the Caucasian participants. So this suggests that by being reminded about a stereotype of your group by having to take a challenging verbal test, that participants actually had lower performance than they normally would if they were in a non-threatening environment. Now, this research has also been extended to look at gender stereotypes, in particular women in math. And so Spencer and his colleagues looked at male and female participants and wanted to examine the stereotype about women's inferiority in math. So in this experiment, they wanted to try to eliminate the stereotype threat about women. The idea is that the threat is already there. You don't need to remind women about their stereotyped inferiority. So the two conditions for this study, the experimental condition where the threat existed, there was no mention of gender. So participants were given a math test with no instruction. So this is sort of what you would expect, the condition that's similar to everyday educational environments. But to try to eliminate the stereotype threat in this identity safety condition, the researchers said that there are no gender differences on this test. So the test was described as being gender fair. And by telling people that there were no gender differences expected, it reduced the possibility that any performance would be attributed to their gender, so it could alleviate the threat that they might be experiencing. And then the researchers gave them a challenging math test and examined their performance. Okay, so for the results, on the y-axis, again, we have the score on the math test, which was corrected for, statistically corrected for guessing. On the left side here, you see the control condition, the non-threatening condition, where participants were told that there were no gender differences on the test, that no gender differences were expected, and you can see that men, represented here by the blue bar, performed equally well as the women. So there were no gender differences in actual math performance in this condition where the threat was eliminated. However, in the control condition, which you can see on the right side, where there was no mention of gender, no extra instruction given, it was just sort of a regular testing environment, men outperformed women. So this is sort of replicates the gender gap we find in math performance, that there's already a threat in the air that women are not expected to do as well in math, and therefore that can lead to underperformance. Okay, so now I have a question for the audience to get you involved in thinking about this phenomenon of stereotype threat. So my question for you is, who do you think is most affected by stereotype threat? And in just a moment, the poll will come up on the right panel of your screen, and I will read you these, the options. So who is most affected by stereotype threat? Is it A, underperforming students, B, average performing students, C, students who highly identify with the domain, such as math, or D, students who disengage from academics? So you have 45 seconds to submit your answer. So click one of the options, A, B, C, or D, and then click the Submit button at the bottom of the right panel. Okay, the poll has ended. If you haven't yet submitted your answer, go ahead and do so. Okay, so we have a wide variety of responses. Looks like the most popular answer was A, underperforming students. That would be the guess that students who don't do well would be most susceptible to this threat. But surprisingly, what research has shown is that students who are high performers are actually most susceptible to this threat. So I'm going to review with you the different conditions that can make the threat more likely. So moderators of stereotype threat. First of all, people who are most highly identified with the domain. So the answer to that poll was C, students who highly identify with the domain. So when we're looking at women in STEM, the women who are most susceptible to stereotype threat are women who highly identify with math and science. So those who find math and science very important to them as a important part of their identity, they are most susceptible, perhaps because they care the most about their performance. Similarly, for math and gender, women who strongly identify with their female gender are more susceptible to stereotype threat. So again, it's more relevant to them if they highly identify with being a woman. As I mentioned, students or people who are high performers in a domain, have high achievement in a domain, are actually more susceptible to this threat than people who are lower performers in the domain. Another variable that affects susceptibility to stereotype threat is the belief that intelligence is fixed rather than malleable. So research with elementary and middle school students has found that if kids believe that you're born with the amount of intelligence that you have and you really can't do much about it, they are more threatened by stereotype threat than people who think that intelligence is malleable and something that you can develop and improve over time. Another factor is endorsement of gender stereotypes. So women who endorse the stereotype that women are not as good in math and science as men, they actually are more susceptible to this threat because this stereotype is more salient to them when they're in a diagnostic testing situation. Finally, another moderator of stereotype threat is people who have low expectations for performance. So if students are taking an exam and they don't expect to do well, they're going to be even more susceptible to the threat that's in the air about their group's negative performance. Okay, so we're going to talk next about some of the situational causes of stereotype threat. And so I have a question for you all again. So here are some different situational situations that can cause stereotype threat, and I'd like you to answer which of these threats do you think is present in your classroom, learning, or work environment. So the first option is having diagnostic or non-diagnostic tests. So does your environment have tests that are evaluative, and are these considered diagnostic of someone's true ability, or are they considered not diagnostic? On exams or surveys or assessments, are people asked to indicate their demographic information before the test, such as marking their race or gender? In your learning environment, is there a numeric minority in the group testing situation? So, for example, it's often the norm for women in STEM to be numeric minorities. So in an AP calculus class, there might only be 3 women. Or also in academic environments that aren't very diverse, ethnic minorities might be in the numeric minority in a classroom. Another situational factor that can lead to stereotype threat is priming someone's race or gender. And this could be done in a variety of ways. A couple of examples are having a lack of diversity of photos on the wall. So in a history class, for example, students might see only Caucasian males represented in the photos. Another example could be the race or sex of the teacher. So if a math teacher is male, that might prime women's identity as a woman. Or finally, are none of these factors present, but rather there's just a threat in the air that you have sensed that there is a risk of people being judged by stereotypes of their group's inferior performance. So think about this for a moment. Which of these are present in your classroom, learning, or work environment? And you can choose more than one item if you would like. So you have about 25 seconds to submit your response. Again, on the right panel, there's responses A, B, C, D, and E. You can choose as many as you'd like, and then click the Submit button at the bottom of the right panel. Okay, so let's look at the responses. Many people said C, a numeric minority in a group testing situation. That alone can prime someone's race or gender. The next most popular one was none. There's simply a threat in the air. Then primed with race or gender. So again, there are many ways that race and gender can be primed. Then the next most popular answer, A, having diagnostic versus non-diagnostic tests. Unfortunately, our academic environments are pretty plagued with diagnostic tests, and so those learning environments can be very threatening. And then the last one is indicating race or gender on a form. And I'm going to come back to that later to talk about how that can affect performance. Okay, so let's move on. I have another question to poll you on. So I've given you a couple of examples of how stereotype threat can lower academic performance. But stereotype threat has other effects on people who are susceptible to this threat. So what do you think that those other effects are? So the question is, in addition to lower academic performance, stereotype threat can lead to all of the following except. So A is devaluing the domain, such as math, avoiding the domain, C, less representation in the domain, such as women in STEM, or D, increased sense of belonging to the domain. So which of these is not an outcome of stereotype threat? Okay, you have about 15 seconds left to submit your answers. And don't forget to click the Submit button on the bottom right of the panel there. Okay, just waiting for the polling results. Okay, it looks like the majority of you said D, increased sense of belonging to the domain. That is correct. Stereotype threat can lead to all of the other items. So stereotype threat can lead people to devalue the domain, to think that it's less important, which can often lead to avoiding the domain. And research suggests that stereotype threat is one barrier that women face in going into STEM disciplines. So it looks like the majority of you have that one correct. Let's talk about some of the other effects of stereotype threat in addition to these. So the most predominant effect that's been studied is lower test performance. So looking at students who are high performing, by putting them in a situation that reminds them of their status as a stigmatized group, whether it be based on their gender or their race or some other demographic factor, by putting them in a threatening testing environment, they can actually perform worse. And remember with the study I showed you from Stanford students that their performance, these students are all high achievers and they're all equally performing well. And so you can take a group of students with a high SAT score and they will show this lower test performance. So you can control for initial ability level and still find a difference in performance. Research has shown that stereotype threat can lead to avoidance of math. You can imagine if women are often anxious and feeling uncomfortable in mathematics classes, they might decide to stop taking math classes. Similarly, research has found that women often report lower behavioral intentions for math-related activities. So reporting less intention to take additional math classes in high school, or less intentions to major in math in college, or to take additional math classes, again related to this sort of avoidance of math. The accumulation of this evidence has suggested that there is lower representation of women in ethnic minorities in STEM fields, due in part to the effects of stereotype threat. So people who consistently feel anxiety about their performance and who feel like they don't belong in the domain, then they're less likely to seek out education and careers in these domains. Another consequence is disengaging, devaluing, and disidentifying with the domain. So disengaging, detaching oneself from the domain, devaluing it, thinking it's less important, and making it less important to your identity is all outcomes. And these are all coping mechanisms that people use to protect their self-esteem. If they're performing poorly in a domain because of this threat, they are going to eventually leave the domain and in order to protect their self-esteem. Another outcome is that people who are susceptible to stereotype threat might be more likely to use self-handicapping strategies. So self-handicapping is setting yourself up for failure so that you have an excuse when you do fail. And this, again, is a protective mechanism. It protects our self-esteem. So students will often engage in this by not studying enough for an exam or putting off doing an assignment to the last minute. If they're worried that they're going to fail, they can set themselves up for failure and then have an external attribution about why they didn't perform well, or having an excuse that doesn't involve threatening their self-esteem. Finally, as mentioned, stereotype threat can lead to a reduced sense of belonging to the stereotype domain. So women report feeling like they don't belong in math and science. They don't feel like they fit in. And so you can imagine working in a threatening environment would make you feel uncomfortable and like you feel like an outsider. Okay, so we've talked about research on stereotype threat, some of the situational factors that can lead to stereotype threat, and some of the effects of stereotype threat. So now my question for you is, how do you think stereotype threat works? What is the process or processes that are underlying how this threat can affect performance? So your response options are A, it affects cognitive resources, B, it affects emotional processes, C, it affects physical processes, D, all of the above, or E, both A, cognitive, and B, emotional processes. So go ahead and select one of those responses. So again, how do you think stereotype threat works? What are the underlying mechanisms that allow it to be so powerful to lead to lower performance and more negative attitudes towards the domain, less identification, and so forth? Okay, about 10 seconds left to vote, and then click the Submit button. While we're waiting for the results, I'll note that this area of research of looking at the underlying mechanisms is a relatively new area in stereotype threat research. So researchers are uncovering all of these mechanisms and what exactly is going on here. So let's see. It looks like the majority of you, 43 of you, have the correct answer, which is D, all of the above. So all of these mechanisms are involved: cognitive processes, emotional processes, and physical processes. So let's take a look at some of these and discuss them a bit further. So how does stereotype threat work? For the cognitive mechanisms, research has shown that one of the problems is negative thought suppression. So when someone is worried about confirming a negative stereotype, that they're trying to push this thought out of their mind as they're taking an academic test. So what it does is, the second point, it is taxing on working memory. So this negative thought suppression requires cognitive resources, and it takes away cognitive resources from the task at hand, the problem-solving activity, and the mind is trying to, again, suppress these negative thoughts and this anxiety. So basically, less cognitive resources are available to perform the exam. People without threat have all of their cognitive processes and resources available to perform. Thus, they can perform better. The physical or physiological mechanisms that have been shown to be related to stereotype threat are physiological arousal. So stereotype threat actually has been linked to a threat response. So increased heart rate, increased respiration, increased sweat responses, and just the body has a sort of a threat response where it tightens up and shows signs of stress. So imagine taking a test under these situations where you have increased heart rate, increased breathing. That is going to be a stressful response. Research on brain imagery has shown that stereotype threat actually impairs prefrontal processing, and the prefrontal cortex is important in processing challenging and complex information, such as problem solving. So in experiments looking at people under taking a test under a stereotype threat condition versus a control condition, these physiological mechanisms were much more active under stereotype threat. Finally, there are the affective mechanisms, or the emotional component. In addition to having negative thoughts, people have also negative emotions that they need to regulate. So stereotype threat causes anxiety, it causes worry, it causes a negative sense of well-being, and so people have to try to suppress these negative emotions in order to try to succeed at the task at hand. So again, that's going to consume people's resources. These executive resources that are needed to perform the task at hand are going to have to be redirected to control the threat aroused by stereotype threat. So under the stereotype threat conditions, people perform less well on cognitive and even social tasks because they have the additional burden of having to self-regulate. Research even shows that stereotype threat can disrupt performance on sensory motor tasks. So it actually has physical effects where, for example, participants respond slower to a task when they're under stereotype threat than when they're not under stereotype threat. And finally, it has effects on behavioral control. So participants under stereotype threat, for example, show less ability to pay attention to a task, and it has shown disruption in academic behavior, such as the ability to study and to regulate behaviors that are necessary to do well in academics. Okay, so I've reviewed this research with you on stereotype threat, so hopefully you understand the phenomenon and how it works. And I want to now share with you a little bit of information about the research that I'm doing, funded by National Science Foundation, looking at effects of stereotype threat on girls' math performance. So the majority of the research that I've shared with you thus far has been done with college students or adults. And so the question that my research team and I have is, how prevalent is stereotype threat among younger students? So what about kids who are in grades K through 12? So the questions that I have in my project are, does stereotype threat decrease girls' attitudes and intentions in math? Is it the same effect that we find with adult women? Does stereotype threat decrease girls' math performance? And does stereotype threat lead to disengagement, discounting, and devaluing math as a domain? So the project that I'm going to share with you today, we call it the Steps to Math Success Project. It's a 3-year study looking at the effects of stereotype threat among middle school students, and we are examining 6th, 7th, and 8th graders to try to pinpoint at what point stereotype threat becomes problematic. And it might be problematic as early as elementary school, and that this study will suggest if it's prevalent in all of these grades. We are working with the Pomona Unified School District in Southern California, and the data I'm going to share with you are from the first-year data with 8th grade students who are in algebra. Algebra is the standard 8th grade level course in California. So the way the study works is that on a first visit, the participants take a pre-questionnaire, which assesses many, many variables, but I'm going to share just a few of those with you today. Some of those variables are their identity with math, whether they identify math as being important to them, their attitudes towards math, their intentions to pursue additional math education or to try to succeed in math, and also their disengagement, devaluing, and discounting of math and academics in general. After completing this pre-questionnaire, we come back on a second visit and we do the experiment where we have a stereotype threat manipulation. So half of the students are randomly assigned to the experimental group, half of the students are randomly assigned to the control group, and in the experimental group, we tell participants that we expect gender differences on the test. We expect that research has shown that boys tend to do better in math than girls. So we remind them of the stereotype threat and make it very salient to them. In the control group, we tell them that we don't expect any gender differences. We tell them that boys and girls do equally well in math and that we're interested in their performance. After taking the pre-algebra test, we give them a post-questionnaire, which again assesses some of the items in the pre-questionnaire, such as their attitudes towards math, their intentions to pursue math, and so forth. And then because this is an experiment, we of course debrief them and tell them about the information we shared with them and why we shared it with them, and then we do a fun math activity with them to encourage them to go into math and science and to show them sort of the fun side of math. Okay, to give you an idea of some of the questions that we asked, the measures related to identification with math are as follows. Questions like, I always feel good about myself when I do well on math tests. Being good in school is an important part of who I am. Doing well on math tests is very important to me. And it is important to me to do well on tests that can tell me how smart I am. The next measures are attitudes towards math. So a few of the items are, I enjoy studying math. I think math is boring. Taking math is a waste of time. Intentions were measured by planning to take more math classes in high school, so taking elective classes, planning to participate in school-related activities about math, such as science fairs or projects, and other questions such as planning on seeking tutoring to improve in their math class or planning on studying to get higher grades in math. The measures for discounting, one item is math tests try to see most tests that try to see how smart you are do not really measure what they're supposed to, so discounting the validity of tests, devaluing. I always feel good about myself when I do on a math test, so not caring anymore how well you do on a test would be devaluing, and disengagement, not caring what tests say about how good you are in math. So these measures are all highly related, but can be an outcome of stereotype threat. Okay, so let me share with you some of the results. Okay, so what we see here are the results for attitudes towards math. And this finding was only significant among the honors students. And you'll remember that stereotype threat is most likely among high-achieving students who are highly identified with the domain. So oftentimes we will see students in honors or AP classes who are most affected by stereotype threat. So here we have some data from kids in an honors algebra class, and on the y-axis the values there are change in attitudes from pre to post-test. And so in this case, positive scores indicate a decrease in attitudes. So taking the pre-test scores minus the post-test scores, if there is a positive value, that would mean attitudes decreased on the post-test. So negative scores here indicate an increase in the attitudes. We have the four conditions you'll see in the legend: the control group, male participants, the control group female participants, the experimental group male and experimental female. Now we only expect stereotype threat among females because the stereotype doesn't exist for males that they are low performers in math. So the females are who we're most interested in, particularly the females in the experimental group. So I've highlighted that here with the red circle. So if we look at the line for the females in the experimental group, we see that those who are highly identified with math had more negative attitudes on the post-test. So remember, positive values mean a negative change in attitudes. Interestingly, the girls who don't identify with math showed an increase in positive attitudes, which is an interesting finding, but they're less identified with math, therefore the threat is less relevant to them. So the girls we are most interested in are those who are highly identified with the domain and in the experimental group. So we did show the expected finding that attitudes decreased, or attitudes about math went down after the experimental manipulation. Okay, so now the results for whether or not the stereotype threat manipulation affected their intentions to pursue additional math education. Here again, the effects were found with honor students, and the data here show post-intentions controlling for their pre-intention. So controlling for initially how interested were they in pursuing math education. So above and beyond their initial interest, did their interest change on the post-test after the manipulation? So here again, we're interested in the girls in the experimental condition, and you can see that the highly math-identified girls had lower post-intentions. So they had less intention to pursue math education after being in the stereotype threat condition compared to the girls that were low in math identification. And you can see the other conditions, nothing really exciting is going on except for the finding that participants higher in math identification in general have higher intentions, which is what we would expect. But the experimental group actually has a negative change in their intentions to pursue math. Okay, now looking at test performance, interestingly, the results we found so far are with the non-honor students. Part of the reason we think is that there are fewer honor students, so our sample size is a bit smaller, and we're actually currently collecting more data with 8th grade honor students to look at this more closely. But what we found so far is what we expected, that females in the experimental condition who are highly identified with math had lower math test scores than the other conditions. And you can see the girls who are low, who don't identify with math, they weren't affected by the stereotype threat manipulation. It's not relevant to them if they don't care so much about math. So again, it's the girls who care about their performance and see math as an important part of their identity. They're the ones who were affected by the stereotype threat. Okay, finally, we also looked at whether students disengaged, devalued, and discounted math on the post-test. And this can be a coping mechanism for people who are dealing with chronic stereotype threat, that if they distance themselves from the domain, they can protect their self-esteem. And so these results are the students who are not in honors classes, but the general population students. And this is also controlling for math identity. So after controlling for math identity, we find that girls in the experimental condition were more likely to disengage, devalue, and discount. So you can see here the green line here is females. And you can see that females in the control group were not very likely to disengage, discount, or devalue. They had no reason to distance themselves from a math test that was described as gender fair. But girls in the experimental condition here, you can see that as a result of the stereotype threat, they devalued and distanced themselves from the domain. So the slope of this line here is steeper and significant for girls. The blue line here is for boys. They also show the same pattern, but to a lesser extent. So the difference here between control and experimental is not significant. And you can see by the difference in the height of the bars that boys in general were more likely to disengage, devalue, and discount. And this could be related to sort of the idea that boys become less academically inclined than girls. And so on. But the main thing we're interested in here is this difference between the girls in the experimental and control groups. Okay, so I've provided some evidence for you that stereotype threat can in fact lead to more negative attitudes towards math, lower intentions to pursue math education, lower performance in math scores, and also the tendency to disengage, devalue, and discount. Now, the question that you might be asking yourselves is, well, what can I do about it? Okay, and so that's the the last part of the presentation, I want to share with you that those of you who are educators or work in learning environments or work environments where stereotype threat could be a problem, what are some of the things that you can do about it, okay? So the first thing that has been shown to be effective in research is to reframe the task. So because evaluative tests are necessarily often diagnostic and create an environment of competition, it's difficult to overcome stereotype threat. But to do that, people can change the language they use to describe a task to avoid highlighting stereotypes or making someone's race or gender salient. So tests can be described as being culturally fair. They can be described as being gender or race fair. And educators can give the expectation to students that everyone should be able to perform equally well and to their highest ability. So if tests are framed as being culturally fair and not biased, then people are going to be less worried about confirming a stereotype. Whenever possible, tests should be described as not diagnostic of ability. This takes away some of the evaluation apprehension and can alleviate the threat. So whenever possible, assessments could be described as a test of creativity, or think of this task as a puzzle, that there are no right or wrong answers. And again, I know this is difficult in an academic environment because you don't want to lie to people, but as much as possible, try to describe the task in a non-stereotypic and very accepting and open way. Another way to reduce stereotype threat is to help people de-emphasize their threat and social identities. So in STEM disciplines, we want to reduce the salience of gender. This can be done in several ways. One is you can have people think about valued traits that they share with both women and men. So try to make the group think of a higher level identity than just gender. So for example, thinking of themselves as a scientist or a mathematician and thinking about positive traits that they share with other scientists and other mathematicians. So sort of de-emphasizing the role of gender completely. Another way is to encourage a complex view of the self. So if people have a very complex identity where gender is just one small component, then stereotype threat becomes less problematic. So in an experiment, researchers had women create self-concept maps, and in one condition they were asked to create very complex self-concept maps, and in another they created simple ones. And the women who had created complex self-concept maps and highlighted multiple identities, they were unaffected by stereotype threat, and this was among even women who were highly identified with math. So by thinking about the self in multiple ways, gender becomes less salient and less problematic, and people can sort of shift their identity during a math test and think about themselves as a scientist or a mathematician rather than as a woman. Okay, another way to de-emphasize threat in social identities is to highlight social identities that are not related to the domain. So, for example, if people are highly identified with being a musician or their religion is very important to them, being able to identify with these identities that aren't affected by math whatsoever can serve as a self-protective function. Another strategy that is shown to be effective with middle school students is self-affirmation. And so this is whenever people experience a threat to the self, they can think about aspects of the self that are positive. And so having people think about their characteristics, skills, values, or roles that they value or view as important can help protect their self-esteem. And there was a study done with African American students who were in a condition where they did use self-affirmation, and at the end of the semester, these kids had a higher GPA than kids who did not use self-affirmation. So it can be a way to buffer the self-esteem and protect from stereotype threat. This one is especially important for educators, emphasizing high standards with assurances of capabilities of meeting those standards. So this relates to how educators give feedback. Giving feedback to a stigmatized group member could be tricky, that if you give feedback, research has that there could be mistrust and discounting of the value of the feedback. So constructive feedback needs to communicate high standards, but the educator also needs to show that he or she believes the students can achieve these standards. This reduces the perceived evaluator bias, it increases motivation on behalf of the student, and it can preserve their identification with the domain. By giving constructive feedback in this positive way, it can signal that that the individual has the ability and belongs in the domain, and that these are assumed rather than questioned. So the criticism or the feedback is not questioning their ability or their belonging in the domain, but is keeping that intact. Another one that many of you probably could guess is having positive role models. Positive role models can improve performance. So research has shown that in a math testing situation, if a math test is given by a highly competent female math teacher, females have an image of an in-group member, another female, who is good in math. So this can reduce the stereotype threat. This is also similar if there is the same race experimenter or teacher. So having an African-American experimenter can reduce the stereotype threat for African Americans. So this is another reason why we need more women in STEM to have more positive role models for our girls. Okay, another one is to help students provide external attributions for the difficulty. So giving them reasons like, well, many students struggle when they're in their first year of calculus, but eventually you'll get better, and you know, everyone experiences this. Or saying something to the effect of the transition into college is challenging and everyone will typically overcome it. So helping them find external and temporary causes for their difficulty rather than having them attribute it to internal factors. Another one is to emphasize an incremental view of ability. So an intervention done with middle school students actually found that when they were sort of trained to think of intelligence as malleable and something that can be changed and developed, they were less susceptible to threat. So our society's over-focus on IQ and intelligence as being something that's innate and you have it or you don't is very problematic in terms of leading to stereotype threat. Okay, just a couple more before we open for questions. An intervention has been done with women telling them about this phenomenon of stereotype threat. So often just telling people about it and telling them that their anxiety could be attributed to this worry that they have about confirming the stereotype, it can lose its power. So by sharing with people this phenomenon, it can be alleviated. Whenever possible, as I mentioned, describe tests as non-diagnostic. Recently, I was collecting data at a school that was doing standardized testing, and the principal came on and had an announcement saying something to the effect of, this test doesn't tell us about your intelligence, and trying to minimize the anxiety that students were experiencing about the test. Making sure that there is a gender-fair testing environment. So this, again, can be done by having equal expectations, minimizing stereotypic assumptions for gender differences, and paying attention to the testing environment to make sure that there's nothing that will trigger or prime gender. And the last one that is very important is whenever giving a test where you ask demographic information, always put these questions at the end of the test. Research has shown that by asking people to mark their gender after taking a test, AP calculus scores were increased by 33%. So the gender gap in performance was reduced by 33% when girls indicated their gender after a test rather than before. And researchers estimate that if the Educational Testing Service implemented this simple change, that there would be an additional 4,700 female students each year who would receive advanced placement credit in calculus. So this is a very simple change that educators can implement immediately, that any standardized testing should ask all demographic information at the end to avoid making race or gender salient. So quickly, in summary, stereotype threat is a real phenomenon that can negatively impact women in math and science. It negatively impacts math attitudes, performance, and intentions. stereotype threat is largely situationally based, and therefore we as educators can change students' learning environments to make them safe for everyone. Okay, thank you for your attention, and I'm going to now open it up for questions and answers. So I'm going to go to the Q&A panel and see what questions we have.
Bettina, this is Greg. Just a reminder that our attendees can't see the questions, so if you can read that off to them, that'd be
okay. Yes, I will do that. Okay, so the first question, someone came in late and asked if I was describing my own experiment. The answer is yes. The second half of the presentation was on my own data with 8th graders. Let's see. One of the questions is about reducing threat or reframing the task. If the instructor who is neutral about performance expectations as effective as the instructor who is affirmative in reframing the test is fair, we expect no differences. So I think the question is if the instructions are neutral, that the instructor says, I don't expect any differences between boys and girls, or I don't expect any differences among different groups of students, then that neutral testing environment will also be effective. So you don't have to say that you expect one group to do better than the other, but simply saying that this test is not biased, or we have not found any differences in the past, that alone will alleviate some of the anxiety that people feel about performing differently. Oh, okay, the question was rephrased. I meant if the instructor says nothing. If the instructor says nothing, the idea is that stereotype threat will still be there. So in the study I showed you with Spencer and colleagues with women in math, the threat condition was that no instruction was given. So the students were given a math test, and the women in that condition performed worse than the men because there was no instruction. So the default in many cases is stereotype threat. And so the challenge is to change the learning environment to alleviate that threat. So by saying nothing, it's going along with the stereotype. Okay, another question is, do you think there is still stereotype threat in private all-girls schools? That's a really great question, and I don't know of much research that has looked at all-girls schools. I know that that the environment is less competitive in the sense of boys being compared to girls. So I would imagine that if girls have positive role models and they are in an environment that is supportive of gender equality, and the other factor is that they're not going to be a numeric minority in the classroom. They're going to be a majority. So I would imagine that all-girls schools would probably have less of a threat than girls in mixed-gender schools. Okay, another question. Would you briefly summarize the major findings from your research so far? Okay, the graphs were a bit distracting. So yes, unfortunately they're a bit confusing. So briefly the summary is that comparing girls in the stereotype threat condition versus the control condition, what we found is that their performance or their responses are moderated by their identity with math. So girls in the experimental condition who were put under stereotype threat, among those students, if they highly identified with math, they were more likely to have negative attitudes towards math after the experiment manipulation. They were more likely to have fewer intentions to pursue math education. They had lower math test performance, and they were also more likely to disengage, devalue, and disidentify with math. And this is compared to girls in the experimental condition who don't identify with math. So the girls who are most susceptible are those who highly identify with math. So hopefully that clarifies your question. Okay, another question. Classroom teachers can't honestly assure students their tests do not show gender bias because they can't know this. How do they handle that? That's a great question, and that sort of goes along with the idea that the academic environment is innately diagnostic. The best way to do that would just be to reframe the task by lessening the diagnosticity of the test. So perhaps saying something to the effect of, this test doesn't tell me how smart you are, this test doesn't tell me your intelligence, but it simply tells me, how much you've learned in the last 4 weeks in this course. Or saying something to the effect of, we've all been in this class together for the past 4 weeks. Everyone has learned the same material. I expect everyone to do equally well. Sort of as much as possible making it a safer situation and alleviating some of that anxiety. And I know that we can't say tests are not culturally biased or gender fair, because we know that many of them are not. But as much as possible, just reframing the task to alleviate some of the evaluation apprehension. You could also say something to the effect of, research in the past has found that boys and girls do equally well given the same level of education and training, which we do know that with research. So that's another way to frame it. Okay, let's see. There's a question about scholarships in STEM. The question is, I've seen much information on educating people about the STEM initiative, but it's difficult to find any STEM scholarships. I do know of the MO SMART grant, but students have to be qualified to receive the FAFSA grant. Do I have any info on science and math scholarships? Unfortunately, I don't have any information on hand. I imagine that that Freda and Mimi probably have some of that information on their STEM Equity Pipeline project. I know that
this is Freda, and I will record the question and then get Mimi to put something up.
Okay, great. Thank you. I imagine that the National Science Foundation has something to that effect, because they are really pushing the STEM agenda. So let's see. Okay, another question is on define non-diagnostic. Aren't all assessments diagnostic? If so, are you advising that we deceive students as to its purpose? Again, this goes back, this is a tricky situation. I don't recommend deceiving students, but again, if a test is diagnostic, which most of them are, you can frame the task as being one where you have equal expectations. I guess that's the best thing that we as educators can do if an exam is diagnostic, which they usually are. So again, just reframing the task that the teacher doesn't have any expectations for differences, that men and women can do equally well, and creating a safer testing environment. Okay. Okay, so there's a question about research by Amy Bell. She found that with college engineering students, they were given instruction about the test being gender neutral, that the gender gap increased. The question is, are you familiar with this work and why the different findings? I'm actually not familiar with that work, but I will certainly look it up. One of the issues with bringing up gender as being gender neutral is it could have acted as a prime for gender. So if these students are highly performing and highly identified with their gender, they might have been reminded of their gender before the test, which could have aroused the stereotype. Another issue is the number of women in the class. If the women were a numeric minority, that could have aroused threat as well. So because there are multiple situational threats on related to gender, alleviating one of them might not always alleviate the threat completely. So I'd have to look at the methodology of that study to give a better answer. But as I said, it's a pretty complex process, and research is still coming out with more moderators, whether you're high identified or low identified, whether you're a high performer or a low performer, whether you endorse gender stereotypes or not. So without measuring many of those moderating variables, it's hard to say, you know, why that threat came about. Another possibility is, was it a male experimenter or a male math teacher? Something else could have elicited the threat, that maybe they didn't believe in the gender neutrality. Okay, a question, do you see more stereotype threats from the same gender? For example, a male instructor not encouraging females with higher aptitudes because it could lead to one less job for a male student. Research does suggest that that opposite gender interactions are more threatening. So having a male instructor with female students is a more threatening environment than having a female instructor, because again, the female instructor can be a positive role model. Certainly women can have stereotypes about women, that some female instructors might think that their female students are low performing and then let off that information. So teacher expectations are very important regardless of the gender of the teacher, but in an experimental situation, a male instructor will definitely elicit more threat than a female instructor. Okay. I'm not quite sure what this question is. The question is, what are your suggestions to avoid using the wording non-traditional in publications? Much of the literature, even for parents, refers to non-traditional. I'm not sure. Are you referring to non-traditional students, like older returning students?
It could be non-traditional in the sense of, you know, entering a STEM career. And I'm wondering if Brenda's thinking that because we use the word non-traditional, we therefore are setting up a stereotype.
Right. I tend to use the term male-dominated. I haven't seen any research on the use of the terms and how that affects people, but that would certainly, if it hasn't been done, it would certainly be a great study of how you frame the discipline. But in my work, I call domains male-dominated or female-dominated by just saying that there's traditionally been, again, the word tradition, historically been males have been a numeric majority. But I do think that that would be problematic of calling something non-traditional, because that, like, it implies a violation of the norm. Okay. Okay, here's a good question. I'm thinking of sharing your suggestions with colleagues. Could you take your research and compile it into a hands-on or into a handout on positive steps to reduce stereotype threat that we could use to help staff with this issue? I could certainly do that. There's another resource I could direct you to, which I've drawn a lot of my information from. Let me see if I can type on the PowerPoint slide. Let's see, Greg, can I add text to my slide here?
Oh, now you should be able to.
Okay. It's not showing up. I wonder if the font is incorrect. I think it's blue font. Okay, let me change it here. I'm going to type a website here. There it is. Okay, can I get over here more? Let's try a text box. That's not working either. Okay, I can give you the website. It's www.reducingstereotypethreat.org, and that is a website that's been compiled by researchers, particularly social psychologists, to make the stereotype threat literature more accessible to non-psychologists and to experimental researchers, to make it more user-friendly for educators. So www.reducingstereotypethreat.org has a section on how to reduce stereotype threat, and there is a bibliography of over 300 studies, some of which are directed towards educators. But I would also be happy to compile a list of recommended reading for educators, specifically of how to change the testing environment, and give that to Mimi and Frida to post on the website.
That'd be great. We'd love to have it.
Okay.
And I think
okay, there we go. There's the website there, reducingstereotypethreat.org. Okay. Okay, are there other questions? Did I miss any?
I think you got them all.
Okay.
Okay, so let's call it a good day. I think you can see that there are a lot of references that Bettina used. I feel like I gained a lot of insight into the research, and so I appreciate that, and I'd like to invite everyone to join us. And I want to thank Bettina for doing this with us, and Greg for his technical assistance at Ohio State. And welcome all of you to join us in the next webinar, which is Tuesday, January the 13th, 2009 at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And we will be looking at step 3 of the 5-step process, which is identifying effective strategies. So we hope that you will join us, and thank you so much for coming to the webinar today.
And remember, this webinar will be available on the www.stemequitypipeline.org website under the Professional Development heading, and then under Archive Webinars in the next few days. When this WebEx program closes, a few survey questions will open your web browser. We'd like for you to answer for us. Thank you for your time.